Good afternoon. Welcome to the final Chosŏn Book Talk series of this semester. My name is Jisoo Kim. I'm director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies and Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Adam Bonnet, who is an associate professor in history at King's University College at Western. He received his MA from Kangwon National University and his PhD from the University of Toronto. He worked at the Research Institute for Korean Studies at Korea University in Seoul before coming to King's in 2012. He published in numerous journals such as Acta Koreana, Journal of Early Modern History, and Review of Korean Studies. More recently, he published his book, Turning Toward Edification, Foreigners in Chosŏn Korea, which came out with Hawaii University Press in December 2020. Professor Bonnet's talk today will be based on this book. This is the first book in English that explores Chosŏn Korea through the lens of foreigners. It is a fascinating research that eloquently challenges the homogeneous myth constructed in the 20th century. I'm so excited to have him with us today. Before we proceed, I would like to mention that there's a book giveaway to those who submit questions to our author. We'll be asking Professor Bonnet to select the best question he likes after the event and send the book to the winner. So please submit your question to Q&A box, not chat box. Our staff will be in touch to mail the book to your address. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Bonnet. Adam, it's all yours.
Hello all. So I'm going to share screen, but first I'll say hello. My name is Adam Bonnet. I teach over in London, Ontario. So some shame not to be in Washington, D.C. today, but it's nice to see you, or of course see people from all around the world here, or to be talking to people from all around the world here. This is my book here. This is the hardcover version of it. As some may know, you can actually also download it for free online. I'm going to share screen now. So yeah, my book is Turning Towards Edification, and it's concerned specifically with foreigners who lived in Chosŏn Korea, the dynasty that spanned from 1392 to 1910 or thereabouts. Definitions can vary. My focus is generally on the late Chosŏn, but partly in the process of trying to, explain the situation of the late Chosŏn, so the period after 1592, I felt it necessary to spend a lot more time with the early Chosŏn, and therefore I also expanded the scope of the book a bit as a result. Over here is a picture from North Korea, both an old map from North Korea and Google Earth from North Korea, and you can see here Ming-Qing Dao, the Ming subject island, and up here Myeongsi-li, Ming subject village, and that is actually the remains of one of my favorite Ming migrants, Kang Shijue or Kang Sejak, who crossed over, who lived just on the edge of the Tumen River after having fled there during the wars of the Ming-Qing transition in Liaodong, and whose family continued to stay there. And he became a representative Ming loyalist foreigner or Chosŏn subject within the frontiers of the Chosŏn state. Here's my book title. I already showed it to you, and you can see the link here. If you go to this link here, bonnet@kingsfaculty.ca, I actually provide a link to how you can access free online versions of the book for those of you who don't win the hardcover in the competition today. So, or you can also find links to how to purchase it or find references to book reviews when they've come in. So just so you know. So who are the foreigners who lived during the Chosŏn period, and who are the foreigners who I'm discussing? Well, roughly speaking, I talk about two periods. I talk about the early Chosŏn, or late Korea early Chosŏn from 1392 to 1592 in the first chapter of my book. And during the very early period of the Chosŏn dynasty, roughly speaking, you can divide the foreign community in Chosŏn into three groups. Two of the groups that are generally considered a little bit more significant in our records or appear most often in scholarship were Jurchens, so Tungusic-speaking people from north of Chosŏn, and Japanese and other maritime people, so people from the coastline to the south of Chosŏn. They settled in Chosŏn through a number of means, or they became part of the Chosŏn state through a number of means. The Jurchens to the north of Chosŏn, so to the north of the Tumen River, in what's Hamgyong province in present-day North Korea, had already been living there when the Chosŏn state established its control over the region. And there were also lots of Jurchens living beyond the Tumen River in areas that nevertheless had a relationship with the Chosŏn state. So they were probably, I would like to emphasize, we don't have, of course, good ethnographic information for exactly who they were. And those of you who know a little bit about modern maritime province in Siberia or modern, even say the various groups in what is now Jilin province will know that there's quite a diversity in languages and people there, including some people who don't speak Tungusic languages, etc. Nevertheless, these groups of people who were hunters and farmers and fishermen and pastoral peoples formed relations with the Chosŏn state, partly as the Chosŭn state tried to maintain control over its frontiers, since some of these would engage in raiding as well as trading and other peaceful interactions with the Chosŭn territory. And so using language by Kenneth Robinson, who studies this subject, the Chosŭn state had various means to transform raiders into traders and raiders into settlers and bring them into the Chosŭn state in that manner. So that was one source of migration into the Chosŭn state. Another one, as I mentioned, was Japanese, and that was really much the same state of affairs. Of course, Japan during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries was a disordered state with very weak centralized control. And one result of it is that there was a lot of piracy, just as is often the case when you've got a maritime region without any proper good control. Pirates tend to establish themselves and launch raids in the vicinity. And these raiders, which had been a serious problem in the late Koryo and early Chosŏn, were also partly brought under control through this process of transforming raiders into traders or raiders into settlers, as discussed by Kenneth Robinson. And so they were settled in various parts of the Korean peninsula and became part of the Korean state. Or in some cases, with both Churchians and Japanese, they actually continued to live outside of the Korean peninsula, but they were brought into a relationship with the Chosŭn state anyway. One case, I sort of jumped over it quickly. At the top with the Jurchens was the status of Bonho, or Songjo Hoin, the Jurchens on the outer edge of the fortifications. So as fortifications were established in northern Chosŭn in the 15th century, they used these Jurchens on the outer edge of the fortifications, partly in order to govern and keep things under control, to administer things properly. If that makes, as a part of defensive structure. So the Chosŭn state had, as it were, it had its own fortifications with its own soldiers, and then it had a community of subject Jurchens and subject Japanese outside of the direct administration of the Chosŭn state, perhaps in the island of Tsushima, but part of the Chosŭn state in another sense. You had this overlapping jurisdiction, as it were, which was also part of Chosŭn's administration. Now, there's a third group that is discussed, but rather less, and these I could roughly describe as Chinese, although, as with Japanese and Jurchens, to call them Chinese is jumping over a lot of de facto ethnic diversity. Already during the previous Koryo dynasty, a lot of Song dynasty traders had arrived in Koryo and had established themselves there. And during the fall of the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the rise of the Ming dynasty, quite a lot of people of non-Korean origin either remained in the Chosŭn, either chose Koryo or Chosŭn as their refuge, as opposed to going back to the Chinese mainland, or they fled this dynastic transition to Chosŏn and became part of the Chosen state. There were a few people who arrived after the Ming Dynasty had been fully established, but not many. Most of this migration sort of ended very early in the 15th century. Nevertheless, one thing, these people were often of Uyghur origin as well, or Mongol origin, so there's some diversity in their backgrounds. And generally, what jobs did they take? And generally the jobs they took, despite the fact they were sometimes Chinese people who had passed exams back in China, sometimes they had some social status in China, they generally took jobs that were below the top ranks of Joseon bureaucracy. So generally what positions would they get? They'd get positions as legal specialist, the person who interprets legal statutes, or medical specialist, or medical specialist or legal specialist, or interpreter, of course, since they could speak Chinese and Korean well. And all of these particular categories, although this hadn't happened, this status group hadn't really developed yet, later became a status group called Jungin, which was distinctly below civil Yangban, the aristocratic, bureaucratic ruling class of the Joseon dynasty in social status. So they're one level below the ones who were best situated, one level below the top ranks of Joseon society. Flip forward. So how were these people, how were these groups settled? The Jurchens, Japanese, and Chinese settled in the Chosun Peninsula. Well, they were settled through a category which I often translate as submitting foreigner. I can debate that particular translation with you later. Sometimes it's just translated as naturalized person. And this status involved generally freedom from personal taxes. So the various personal taxes, you'd still have to pay land tax if you had land. In exchange for which you'd have to pay a tribute to the Board of Rights. And you'd be given land if there was land available, and sometimes you'd be given wives, and you'd certainly be given a Korean surname. These became part of the things that were granted to foreigners who were settled in the Chosen state. The wives, since this is going to come up, were generally people of mixed commoner and slave origin. I'm guessing in part because such unions were in theory illegal, and so it's fairly easy to grant wives from that particular category group. But I've not fully established why that was the case, but very often granted wives. And the ideological content of this status, Hyanghuayin status or submitting foreigner status, is interesting. So I refer to this passage by an official No Sashin. Since antiquity, emperors and kings did not refuse any outside people who, longing for morality, came to submit to transformation. However, I've not yet heard of a case of outside people coming to submit in response to one who deliberately sought to obtain their submission. So ideologically, submitting foreigner status or Hyanghuayin status in Korea as in China was premised on the idea of a sage king receiving the voluntary submission of people from abroad who wanted to find a proper, morally organized Confucian state. One result of this ideological context is a lot of scholars will therefore assume that Chinese were not on the receiving end of this status, because they'll assume that how on earth could Chinese, who are also from a Confucian state, be assumed to come to receive the moral edification of the Joseon monarch. Certainly this particular formulation fits very well with Churchians and Japanese. So it's an ideological construct. Of course, it's not the reality. There are all sorts of reasons why Churchians and Japanese would want to settle in the Joseon state. But it's, so very often people will assume that Chinese therefore were excluded from this particular category. So were they excluded from this category? In fact, what's interesting is looking through records from the early Chosun is how often the basic framework of submitting foreigner status is imposed identically on people of Chinese origin, and or sometimes slightly different formulation. And a great example, which I found in the Joseon Veritable Records, is the case of the Ming family, or the Myung family. And the Myung family is itself incredibly interesting. The Ming-Yuzhen was one of, during the fall of the Yuan dynasty, was one of the successor states that formed during the fall of the Yuan dynasty in the region of Sichuan. His surname was not originally Ming. It was that he took that surname. Why? Because what does Ming mean? It means Manichaean. So his Manichaean enthusiasm caused him to take the surname Ming. His successor state, the Xia Empire, did not survive, was eventually overthrown by the Ming dynasty. And after the overthrow of the successor state, Ming-Sheng, the son of Ming-Yuzhen, and were sent to Chosŏn along with some other resisting empires, successor states who had fought against the Ming, with the demand that they not be enrolled as either soldiers or commoners. So they became one of the examples of the Chinese origin foreigners who were settled in Chosŏn during the very early Chosŏn. And the heir of one of Ming-Sheng, Myung-Gui-sok, complained during the reign of Songjong that he was being terribly mistreated because he had in fact been enrolled for the military tax, and how incredibly unfair this was. The debate about it is very interesting because in the debate, ultimately, Hejong argued that this should be approached via the precedent of Hyangwa status and submitting foreigner status, despite the fact Myung-Gui-sok is of Chinese origin, or is at least patrilineally of Chinese origin. So there should be no problem, but because even with submitting foreigners at that time, after a certain number of generations had elapsed, they lost their foreign status. Similarly, Ming-Sheng, according to this precedent, should not have any protection from military or military service or commoner personal taxes granted to him. He should be treated just like an ordinary subject. So this is an example again of how submitting foreigner status and the rules surrounding submitting foreigner status were extended to Chinese as well. And this is just a lovely anecdote. So among the descendants of Ming-Sheng, there was a senior clerk who was distracted and didn't do his job. A senior official said to him pityingly, "Although the Ming emperor conquered the realm, if it were up to you, the empire would have collapsed." Those who heard this clutched their bellies and laughed. So this descendant of Ming, this is from Jibong Yusol by Yisu Guang, an early 17th century encyclopedic work. And he has a whole section on jokes. And many of these jokes are in what would now seem in pretty poor taste. I very often feel sympathy for the people who are on the receiving end of these jokes. Although I should say I used this in my third year class this year, and in my third year class, some of them really appreciated 17th century Korean humor. So it's depends on who you are, I guess. Nevertheless, this joke, what's interesting about it is here again we've got someone of Chinese origin, someone in fact who'd been granted very special status by the demands of the first Ming emperor, the Hongwu emperor himself, and yet he is in the position of senior clerk, clearly placed below senior officials in the hierarchy. And this was generally true of people of Chinese origin. Those who had any position in the bureaucracy at all were placed in the ranks of clerks, of interpreters, of specialists. They were not actually competing for significant positions in the bureaucracy. And in this case, they're even the object of humor and mockery by a member of the senior aristocrat who evidently doesn't know the fact that Ming-Sheng has absolutely nothing to do with the Hongwu emperor. He's from a completely different branch of the Ming dynasty, a completely different family. So again, it gives a little bit of an idea of their status, I guess. So what else do we have? So moving from that period to the late Chosŏn, during the late Chosŏn, a number of other groups entered into the Chosŏn state, some of whom had been in the Chosŏn state before. One of them, well, two of them have already been mentioned, and are somewhat similar. So Jurchens, who lived in the northern border of Chosŏn, were given a choice in the 17th century, early 17th century, between joining Nurhaci's armies and going further going into becoming part of Nurhaci's new Manchu state, since Nurhaci of the Jianzhou formed, who was a Jurchen community, formed a new Manchu state in the late 16th, early 17th century, and he claimed authority over Jurchens living in Choson's northern territory and removed them from Choson's territory whenever he could. Those of who did not want to become of Nurhaci's state fled south, and that became one influx of foreigners into at least further south in Korea. In addition, there were Japanese invaded Korea between 1592, 1598, and Japanese who invaded Korea between 1592 and 1598 included some who just stayed. They deserted, and it's not surprising. The Japanese state hadn't been unified for very long, and in any case, you know, very often rather than national loyalties, personal loyalties, whether your boss is horrible, whether you've fallen in love, can be more important for the decisions people make in life. And as I always say to my students, and I get interesting answers, if you had a choice between serving your country loyally and betraying your boss, which would you do? And most of them say they'd rather betray their boss, which is interesting. As an example with Kim Chung-sun as well, and with a number of Japanese, is they just couldn't stand the Japanese army as it invaded Korea 1592, 1598. And it happened the Chosun state was willing to accept their defection because, of course, they brought with them military skills, the ability to shoot muskets, various military abilities that the Chosun state did not have. And so quite a lot defected to the Chosun state during this period. Then it was not only Japanese who defected. Chinese, in 1593, the Ming Empire intervened against the Japanese in the war and sent armies into the Chosun state to fight the Japanese armies, the Japanese invaders, and a lot of them didn't get along with their bosses either. And so quite a lot of Ming military defected during this period. They also took jobs of various sorts, including military experts, but also geomancers, some of the jobs that Chinese had taken in the early Chosun as well. Starting in 1518, date wrong, 1618, a war broke out between Ming and Qing in Ming and Manchu in Liaodong to the north of Chosun, and one result of which is a lot of Chinese either fled or joined up with the armies under Mao Wenlong, which was based in Chosun territory, in an island off Chosun territory. And quite a lot of them ended up retreating and remaining in the Chosun state, even though a lot were forcibly removed later. And then finally, even after Chosun submitted to the Qing, the Qing Empire, the Manchu Qing Empire in 1637, there were a number of other Chinese who were emancipated, manumitted by Chosun hostages, Chosun princes who were hostage in Mukden, in the Manchu capital of Mukden, and who returned to the Chosun state, or were settled in the Chosun state after 1644. So there were a number of entrances of Chinese, in other words, up to the mid-17th century. And then finally, there are a number of other peoples. There weren't as many people coming in and out of the Chosun state in the 17th century as had been true in the 15th. But there are also Dutch people, famously, who settled in the Chosun state. Vertevri or Bagyon, who came in 1627. Hamel and some other Dutch people in 1653. There's even very, very late in 1802, there are some people of uncertain origin who I think were probably slaves of Europeans who wanted to get away and certainly didn't want to say their origins particularly, since they didn't want to get set back, who are still dealt with through this submitting foreigner status. So there are a number of people who continue to arrive in the Chosen state through the 17th and even in the early 19th century. So the category here, I'm just going to give a brief overview, roughly speaking, takes us to the broad context of most of my book. What is the context to a lot of these late Chosen, the late new foreign community of the late Chosun? Well, as I mentioned, the Chosen state had been at war with, or on and off conflict with, the rising Manchu state after 1619. And in 1636, 1637, the Manchu state, which had then become the Qing Empire, invaded Chosun and forced the Chosen monarch to submit to the Qing and abandon its previous connection with the Ming Empire in China. By 1644, the Qing had actually conquered Beijing, the Ming capital of Beijing, and had really brought to an end any possible connection between the Chosen state and the Ming Empire, although there were still possibilities and rumors of possibilities that continued into the defeat of the last Ming remnant in Taiwan in 1683. 1704, sorry, I lost my place a little bit. One result of this is that Chosun was completely subordinate. It was independent. It continued to be an independent kingdom, but it was subordinate to the Qing Empire. It acted in its outward diplomatic policy just as it had to the Ming. It sent, I didn't discuss it much before in this presentation, but it would send tribute missions to the Qing capital at least 3 times a year. In all of its diplomatic context, the Chosen monarch would describe himself as an inferior to the Qing emperor. But internally, as famously, they kept a completely different framework. So they would, internally, they would act as if, in the 17th century, act as if they'd never abandoned the Ming at all. And by 1704, when the Ming had truly and absolutely vanished, they actually established a shrine in the palace complex in which they honored the altar of great gratitude, in which they honored the Ming, and in which they, as it were, offered sacrificial offerings to 3 Ming emperors: the Hongwu Emperor, the first Ming Emperor. I'm jumping over some history here, but eventually the Hongwu Emperor, the Wanli Emperor, who was the emperor who sent military aid to Chosŏn during the Imjin War, and the Chongzhen Emperor, who was the emperor who committed suicide after the Qing invasion in Qing conquered Beijing, or before that, after Beijing fell to peasant rebels in 1644. So this transformation, I'll just give you a little bit of a spoiler in case I run out of time, created a real transformation ultimately in the status of Chinese in origin foreigners in Korea. Throughout the 17th century, Chinese foreigners in Korea had in fact continued to be classified very, very clearly as submitting foreigners, of people of submitting foreigner ancestry, classified in exactly the same way as Churchians and Japanese and Dutch. But after 1754, after the 1750s, partly in relation to this establishment of Ming ritual loyalism in the palace complex, many of them had their status transformed to very specifically imperial subjects, to people who were actually classified by their relationship to the Ming state. It's a subject that comes a little bit outside the range of my presentation today, but I thought it might inform a little bit of what I say next. People who look at the 18th century will therefore often imagine that therefore the Chosun was loyal to Chinese, defined Chinese very differently from Jurchens and Japanese, and gave them special status that differed a lot from Jurchens and Japanese. But in fact, throughout the 17th century, it's very clear they were treated identically as submitting foreigners. A major thing we noticed in the 17th century as well in the early Chosŏn, foreigners of submitting foreigner status had their had almost permanent bestowal of high status granted upon them, permanent bestowal of submitting foreigner status granted to them. During the late Chosŏn, I think I'm a little bit flustered. So during the early Chosŏn, rather, there had been a limited period of time during which submitting foreigner status could be granted to them. During the late Chosŏn, 17th century, it's clear that this had become permanent. Sorry for my stumbles there. So as it were, it went from being a limited period of time during which submitting foreigner status was granted, or a limited number of generations, to becoming a permanent hereditary status during the 17th century. And I've got a few examples of this from a few documents which I translated. This is one, again, from the 1750s, but of course it applies to the 17th century as well. Upon investigating old documents of our Board of Rights, the term Hyanghuain, or submitting foreigner, encompasses originally the Bono of the 6 garrisons who received the clan seats like Hunryonggang and settled in the interior, and also Japanese wretches who did not return to Japan. After the Gapshin year, those Liaodongese who avoided the barbarians and fled to the east were also called Hyangwa and settled, taking clan seats like Sochok, Daewon, Joygang, and did not return. Their descendants are also called Hyangwa, or submitting foreigners. So even in the 18th century, up to the mid-18th century, what this document shows is that there was no actual clear distinction drawn between foreigners of Chinese origin and foreigners of Jurchen and Japanese origin. Okay, so another example also from the 1750s, which I find sort of interesting because it does draw a bit of a distinction, but still clearly categorize them in the same category. Submitting foreigners on the coast are either the remnant people of China or the displaced peoples of other regions. It is clear they should not have the same corvée duties imposed upon them as on ordinary subjects. When they first arrived, the Board of Rights provided them with especially generous treatment and worried that they had no livelihood, settled them on the coast and had them fish for a living. Submitting foreigner status alleviated their impoverishment by removing service duties, truly the epitome of a sage monarch's desire to comfort people who have come from far away. Again, this is from the mid-18th century, during a period which, as I mentioned, was a period in which people of Chinese origin did have their status improved. And yet we can see from this document that it was still possible in the mid-18th century, even when you're distinguishing people of Chinese origin with certainly much more elevated language, the remnant people of China or the remnant people of the greater country, as opposed to the displaced people of other regions. Both Min and Meng, certainly Meng is really, I think, tax-paying subject as it tends to be used in Chosŏn. It's not, Min isn't particularly highfalutin, but Meng is certainly less highfalutin than that. It was still possible in the 18th century not to really to treat both of them as encompassed by this word submitting foreigner, and also notice at the bottom to use language which clearly defines them as poor people coming to receive edification, people coming to receive the transforming power of the chosen monarch. Okay, so what I've got, I think, probably coming to the end of my allowable time, but I'm going to have 3 quotations that sort of cap this subject up. Very often people will describe the Chosŏn state as a Sinocentric state, right? And they have justification for that. The Chosŏn monarch would send its envoys to the Chinese capital, either the Ming capital or the Qing capital, and would use language, as for instance, Shixiang Wang has discussed for the early Chosŏn very recently, use language that clearly defined them status inferiors to the Ming Emperor, and the Chosen state were on the receiving end of transformation by the Ming state. For this reason, people will often assume, therefore, that Chosen state would treat people of Chinese origin very differently from people of Jurchen or Japanese origin. As I've discussed a bit for the early Chosen, even in the early Chosen, it's clear it's not the case, that all of them could be received in this category of submitting foreigner. But beyond that, all of them were clearly kept out of the upper ranks of the late Joseon hierarchy, right? That Churchians and Japanese often gained position as guards, sometimes as interpreters. Chinese seem to have gained a more diverse series of positions as clerks, as legal specialists, as medical experts. But they tended to be kept out, clearly out of the top ranks of the Chosen civil aristocracy. But even in the language which was used, they could still be described as people who are at the receiving end of the transforming power of the Chosen state. So this, in a sense, isn't surprising. It fits very well with research by, well, for instance, by Professor Kim, your late supervisor, Dr. Jaeon Kim Ha-bush, of course, has discussed that in very, very movingly in her books about the late Joseon, also discussed by Shixiang Wang recently in his dissertation. So in a sense, it's not surprising, but it does rub against a little bit against what many people's assumptions are. That although the Chosen state saw itself as subordinate to the Ming, it also saw itself as its own transforming center, its own cultural center, its own civilizing center. And people of Chinese origin could also be just as much on the receiving end up to really the mid-18th century, just as much on the receiving end of the Chosen state's civilizational transformation as people of Jurchen, Japanese, or Dutch origin. Of course, because people of Chinese origin aren't the Ming Emperor, right? That they're just ordinary deserting soldiers, aren't the Ming Emperor. They're not necessarily high officials. They're also outsiders in need of moral transformation. I'll elaborate on some of my thoughts on that a little bit later if it comes up in discussion. On the other hand, the Jurchens were very fundamentally part of the Chosen state during the early Joseon. And so while a lot of people assumed that Joseon as a Confucian state would have wanted to reject Churchians and Japanese, in fact, of course, Churchians and Japanese often had pre-existing connections to the Chosen state. So in many ways, they were very welcome in the Chosen state, or valued parts of the Chosen community whose loss during the unrest of the late 16th, early 17th century is very much regretted. This is one of my favorite passages, once more from the early 17th century's Jibong Gyusol. Recently, No-chu, or Norhachi of Janju, has become very powerful and forcibly removed the Punho, leaving almost none behind. So, though someone settle in our territory and enter deeply without permission, sorry, a bit of a spelling mistake there, a typo there, who could dare complain? When the lips are gone, the teeth grow cold. This is an unspeakable matter. So far from rejecting Churchians and Japanese, Churchians and Japanese were in many ways very welcome within the Chosen state, especially when they played very specific roles within the Chosen state. And this was true of, say, the more prominent Japanese defectors. At the beginning of the Imjin War, they weren't very welcome, as an invading army generally often isn't. But steadily, as they became more useful to the Chosen state, their defection actually was framed as an example of the civilizing and transformational power of the Chosen state. On the other hand, Chinese deserters were often very unwelcome. And there's an interesting exchange, which I'll just briefly mention, with one well-known Chinese deserter, Shi Wen-yong or Shi Mun-yong in Korean. And he the process of his desertion is a little bit murky. By the way, this refers to some slightly upsetting subject matter, just so you know. He arrived as a deserter during the Imjin War through some process, and he was allowed to stay via Zhongying Hong, who was the leader at that point of a righteous militia, who arranged for his marriage with a local woman, and partly because of his skill in geomancy and divination. Now, Zhongying Hong was controversial during the late 16th, early 17th century. It was eventually, of course, purged. And this was one of his crimes that he had, as people accused. He forced the daughter of a young aristocrat to marry a foreigner. As for forcing a Sajuk to marry with a Chinese deserter, in the customs of our country, to marry a foreigner, this is shameful even for the women of peddling households, not to mention women of Sajuk aristocratic background. Zhonghun forced the daughter of Zhang Han to marry Shu Wenyong, a Chinese deserter who was good at geomancy and divination. Even if this had involved her mother, who had been violated by the Japanese, this would have been inappropriate for the innocent daughter. So, in fact, it's not entirely true. This is part of factional conflict. There were, in fact, lots of cases of marriages between foreigners and Koreans. I don't think it was universally considered shameful, or at least my reading of the record suggests it was not. But you can see here an example of that even Chinese could be seen as outsiders and as problematic and as disruptive to the state. All very contextual, right? There were, of course, Chinese were welcomed in the Chosen state during the late 16th, early 17th century, but there also could be Chinese who were considered troublesome, problematic, whose presence in the Chosen state was considered disruptive. And I should say, if you keep on reading this passage, one concern is that if they're deserting from the Ming dynasty, their act of desertion suggests a general breakdown of loyalty in general, because of course the Ming dynasty as the superior power and overlord to the Chosen state, or hegemon to the Chosen state, in a sense underlie all loyalties, including loyalties of slave to master, including family loyalties, and so forth. So just perhaps complicates the picture a bit. And then I think I am over time, if that's the case, but I will just read one more passage, and we can go to question and answer. This is from my favorite person in all the world, Kang Shijue, and it gives an example of how Chinese status by no means necessarily conferred any particular higher status on people of foreign origin. So, Nam Guman, I have seen that of those Chinese who have come to Korea, many are haughty and greedy and beg shamelessly. Only Shijue, or Kang Sejak, my favorite person in the world, did not engage in vain boasting. Only he did not take that which was not his due. He did not speak of duplicitously or engage in suspicious activities. His reputation spread through the village, and he taught his good habits to his sons. That is why he is worth writing about. So, what is key here? Kang Sejak was one of the in the late 17th century, he was one of the first people of Chinese origin who gained the full support of the Chosen state and had his status raised very considerably through the support of the Chinese state. He comes up quite a bit in my book. I also wrote an article on it in the journal Korean Histories, which goes into some of the reasons why. I won't talk about that too much now. But what's interesting here is, of course, at this point in the late 17th century, when he's being granted this special status, he's being granted this special status as something exceptional. That unlike most Chinese, in typical racist language, Kang Shijue is one of the good ones, right? That would be, and I think actually that's not completely inappropriate for the context. Because, of course, I mean, what really we have here in this description is the standard unfair description of refugees in general, anywhere in the world, that anywhere in the world you'll have people who are fleeing from war and fleeing from trouble or in desperate situations can often be described as dishonest, as shameless beggars, as somehow immoral. In the late 17th century, the memory of the flight of Chinese from Liaodong into the Korean peninsula was still relatively fresh. And Kagzije could therefore be marked as unusual, an unusual contrast to other Chinese. But again, despite this idea that Chosŏn as a Confucian state would have treated its status superior, the Chinese emperor, and its subjects as somehow distinguished from other foreigners. In fact, in this case, again, we see clearly that by contrast, into the late 17th century, Chinese could be marked as sort of troublesome outsiders who lacked, basic morality, who lacked the basic characteristics of civilization, despite this overall diplomatic structure and organization. So I think I am over time, am I not? So I should stop here and go on to discussion, if that's okay.
Hey, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. Yeah, I mean, I just have so many questions, but we already received many from our audiences. But I would like to use my prerogative as a moderator and begin asking you a few questions that I have. So I know in your book, you're very cautious of not conflating, not bringing in like modern or contemporary notions such as like, heterogeneous or multiculturalism or, in this Chosŏn context. And I fully agree and respect that. And it obviously, based on your, title of the book, you call them foreigners. And Changhua-in, you also translate that as submitting foreigners. Yeah. So my question is, they came to Chosun, Korea, settled down and lived throughout, and they also married Chosun women. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, so throughout those centuries as they settled down and, did they continue to live in Chosun, recognizing that they're still foreigners? Or because, for example, in the case of their children, as you know, in the Chosun, children inherited mother's status. So if they married commoner or slave women, then I'm just wondering what the status of the children might be. Were they still recognized as foreigners, or were they, given Chosun status as 양인 or, slave? So I guess my question is, do you get any sense of what kind of identity that they have constructed over the years or centuries in the late Chosun? And related to that, well, not related to that, and I have one question. This is my personal interest, but you mentioned that these, Chinese deserters, they were often employed as legal specialists and medical, or medical experts. So I guess they're in the Chungin category. But I'm interested if they're, employed as legal specialists. Do you have, are there sources that discuss like what role they played, or how they were involved? Like, were they in the county, or were they in the central bureaucracy, in the board of punishments, or where were they located, and what was their work?
So both excellent questions, and I just realized the fact that you were the moderator caused me to overemphasize the single legal specialist I know. So I only know one. So to answer the last question first, and that was I only know of one legal specialist, and he seems to have been employed in the central state, in that he actually got in already starting the late Koryo, that he got into as part of late Koryo, early Chosun. He was employed in the central state as legal specialist, and just essentially interpreting statutes. So I don't know, it would be lovely to have a little bit more knowledge about him, and if there were other people like him, and maybe you'll find that out before I do, probably, in your own work. As for what were their identities, I think if I were to describe it, I actually had a later part of the presentation which I cut off, but if I were to describe it in one or two words, I think it was, this is a cop-out, it was a contested identity. And it was a contested on various different levels. Where did they live? They tended to live in little fishing villages. In the late Chosun, a lot of them were living in fishing villages. Why? I can only speculate, but I guess that it was increasingly hard to find land for them. And so moving them to fishing villages is often easier. In the fishing villages, of course, they would then provide a tribute in dried fish to the central state, to the Board of Rights specifically, which the Board of Rights depended on in order to pay its petty officials. But my overwhelming impression is these villages were really, really hard to police. And so one of the challenges of the late Joseon state as it tried to create this Chinese status is just figuring out whose status backgrounds were what. A lot of them didn't know, a lot of them knew they were submitting. There's one case which I discuss in my book where a guy who was obvious of Jurchen origin, in that his clan's name is Hungyonggang or Heilongjiang, which refers to the Amur River, the Heilongjiang River on the border between Siberia and northeastern China, argued that he was of Chinese origin. And this was the late 18th century, and Zhongzhou got, of course, this was rejected out of hand as quite ridiculous. But I don't think there's any reason to believe he thought this was ridiculous, right? Otherwise, how would he dare, go to the Chosun court and say, I'm of Chinese origin? We could get him into trouble when he's not. Other cases, they're people of Korean origin who had traveled to the Ming Empire and back during this period of disruption. And they also classified themselves as being of Ming origin. And this created further contestation. A lot of cases very unclear. There are records in the 17th century of different people entering these villages, of it being sort of unclear who really belongs there or not. Anyway, I'm going on a little bit, but everything you said is absolutely correct for the rest of the audience. And I'll just say that's how it should have happened, and yet everything was a complete mess.
Okay, thank you. I would like to move on to our audience's questions. I'll begin with Sihad Kubat's question. What do we learn about the maritime Muslims and their lives in Chosun from the Korean sources? Also, since you put them in different categorization in the first slide, do Korean sources differentiate Muslims, Turks, and Uyghurs?
A fantastic and difficult question. So I did not successfully solve that particular problem, and I would love to solve that problem. Uyghurs are not always, and Muslims are not always clearly differentiated or it's hard sometimes to distinguish because you have the same character as you know, hui, used for both. There were Uyghurs in the very early Chosun, Uyghur officials who had been, very famously, the Sol family, who had been based originally in the area of Nanjing. They had been, as you know, I'm sure, that Uyghurs became an important part of the bureaucratic class during the Mongol Yuan Empire, and some of them formed connections with the Koryo state, which had been a subordinate to the Yuan Empire, of course, and some of them then entered Chosun, or entered Korea during the Yuan-Ming transition. But we also have this strange group of people, which are interesting group of people. I think they're clearly supposed to be Muslim. And if someone told me I'm completely wrong, I'd also completely accept it. And they seem to be coming in, according to the early Chosun records, to be coming in via Kyushu. So not via Inner Asia, but via Kyushu. And I just make some guesses about them. And my basic guess is they're probably part of the Muslim diaspora of coastal China, who were given a choice during the early Ming to either become essentially Chinese, to become purely Ming subjects, or to continue their overseas trading empires. And as some, forgotten the name of the scholar again, as recently discussed, some of them then chose to leave, and they became part of a sort of an overseas Chinese Muslim diaspora. I'm guessing that's who they are. I haven't found a very good answer yet, so I included in my book. I'm hoping that some reviewer will tell me how wrong I am, and so then I'll know some more. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. Next, actually, this is also one question that I had by Oana Baboy. Are there any records of foreign women coming, perhaps as refugees, to Chosŏn? What status would they have, both at home and in Chosŏn?
So yes, there are records of foreign women. One problem, I should say, I didn't go fully into the historiography of this, but one challenge we have for the late Chosŏn is a good chunk of our records are slightly late records. Not all, but a good chunk of them are slightly late records. And when we're actually given names, they tend to be men, because the men, of course, are the ones who are leading the patriline, and they are therefore the ones that are providing the Chinese imperial subject related to the ritual transformation of the late 18th century. They're the ones who are providing sort of the Ming loyalist origin story within the late Chosen state. I know I'm jumping over a few issues, so I hope I'm clear. I'll try and clarify things, but if I may back up briefly, just to explain this point, because I know I didn't go over it properly in my presentation. I mentioned very briefly there was a mid-18th century transformation, and that this mid-18th century transformation was related to the sort of the ritual worship honoring of the Ming within the Chosen Palace. And people who could claim Ming origin could therefore become associated with the Chosen Palace as part of this ritual honoring of the Ming. Now, as again I mentioned, the late Jian Kim Habush, as she of course discusses, and following partly work by people like Zheng Jia, when the late Chosen was ritually honoring the Ming in this altar in the palace complex, they are clearly establishing themselves as the exclusive heirs to the Ming loyalist, to the Ming Empire. So they were rejecting the Qing and establishing themselves as the exclusive heirs. Ming migrants were brought into this system. They continued to be in a subordinate position, but of course they gained somewhat elevated status. And one thing that went along with this elevated status were a series of biographies, often produced with the support of the Chosen state, which would therefore record essentially the patriline, the history of the patriline. As you can imagine, women don't get mentioned very often in these histories of the patriline. They come up occasionally. There are some cases of former Ming palace women who fled to the Chosen state. But from time to time, we do get records of women, certainly in the early Chosen, of Jurchen and Japanese women. We have records of them arriving in the Chosen state. During the Imjin War, of course, most of the Japanese deserters were men. And so it's mostly men that we see in our records. I think exclusively men in our records. There may be, I'm sure there were some women though. During the unrest in Liaodong, during when the Qing state, or Manchu state rather, was warring with the Ming in Liaodong, we definitely have records of women entering Chosŏn and marrying with chosen people, and Churchians marrying with chosen people. So we have lots of records of women. Sometimes we have names as well. We don't perhaps have quite as much as always the challenge. We don't have as much as we like, but certainly get some interesting references to them. Did I answer all parts of that question, Jisoo? Yeah, I think so. Thank you. So next we have a question from our Deputy Director of GWIKS, Greg Brzezinski. I better ask this question so he doesn't get angry at me. So he asks, I'm interested in the origins of the term
when the lips are gone, the teeth grow cold. Was this also used to describe relations with Jurchens by the Choson dynasty? It was used often by communist China to describe the relationship with North Korea.
So I don't know. My bad. I've never looked up the origin. I'm sure it's a great. It's quite a horrific image, right? I mean, your lips are gone, as your lips are ripped from your face, as your teeth are cold. Who would say that? Yeah, I don't know the precise origin of that phrase. That's a great question, and I should have looked it up at some point. But I've heard it also even before the. I think it was also used by the Ming with reference to the Chosån during the Imjin War as well. So I think when the Chinese communists were using it with reference to North Korea, they were deliberately reflecting the early experience of the Ming during the Imjin War. So that's actually a very interesting subject, and I'm afraid I can't tell you the precise origin of the phrase, but I'm sure it's findable.
Okay, thank you. Next by Jonathan Chiarella. Naturalists sometimes speak of myths that fly in the face of the historical record, and official narratives from Seoul tend to tacitly endorse a pure history, just as most nationalist histories are selective. However, reality is more complex. Yes, the Choson state kept out those with traceably foreign ancestry from the upper echelons, but in a modern Korea without legal classes, it seems that Seoul would want to remind Koreans of their own origins and to encourage those of recently mixed heritage to look up to those who assimilated or became valued subjects, to play up some melting pot history, wouldn't it? So I guess can you comment on his point?
Absolutely, and that from the conclusion I get of my book, I get into that a bit. And in my original, anyone who's written a book will know that when adds and cuts constantly, I had other details in that as well. It's actually an interesting process, which sort of occurred as I was writing my book. And one reason why I felt some pressure to stop being so lazy and get it done quickly, I was a bit late, is that this is very much part of some of the current interests of the South Korean state, which is indeed in the 80s and early 90s, especially, people tended to emphasize homogeneity, especially of course during the Park Chung-hee era. Very few people want to emphasize homogeneous ethnicity to the same extent now, especially as you get such a large number of Koreans of immigrant background, or a growing number of Koreans of immigrant background within South Korea. So there are a number of books, educational books, that have been produced emphasizing the foreign origins of Koreans, and indeed the article, the journal Damunhwa Yeongu, or Damunhwa 교육 Yeongu, Multicultural Education, will sometimes publish articles on this subject. So it is indeed very much part of the changing attitude, not just within academia, but also within popular understandings of history. And referring to your point with which you introduced this subject, Jisoo, I started out writing my dissertation resisting vigorously against the multicultural narrative. And somehow halfway through writing this book, I said, oh, don't be such a snob, Adam. Give the people what they want. And so I also think that I don't want to resist it too strongly. I think there are good reasons why South Koreans are increasingly exploring multicultural aspects of their history. There's some, as we know, whether we talk about multiculturalism in Canada or the United States or South Korea, there are some unfortunate aspects to that narrative. It often, as it were, strengthens the idea of a true the true Canadian as opposed to the multicultural Canadian. And that's a very unfortunate narrative which often is brought in with the language of multiculturalism. It's often purely performative. It can often be quite unpleasant. But I have abandoned some of my my academic pedantry there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't think it's really multicultural that you can discuss in the Chosun context, and I can definitely see why you're trying to, resist that. Because I mean, obviously, in your book, you're talking about edification, right? So it's really not about multicultural, but those, foreigners trying to educate them and cultivate them through this, Neo-Confucian values, or as in the book you emphasize about, Chunghwa or Soljunghwa in the Korean context.
And as I think actually mentioned by the questioner, sorry, I forgot the questioner's name, I apologize. A connected issue there is, of course, under Pak Chung-hee, which is the great time for the overemphasis of homogeneity, there was at least an implied lack of, the militarized state, where everyone is equally subordinate to the South Korean military regime. Right, all men have the equal responsibility to the military. All women have various other sorts of responsibilities, but all are subordinate to the South Korean state. Everyone in the Chosun dynasty had a different social background, as you were discussing. And it was so Sajuk aristocrats were not in the same category as commoners. They didn't share the same duties. They didn't share the same identity. And so one way which multiculturalism doesn't quite work is that, yes, they were being assimilated, but they were being assimilated, as it were, into a state which strongly emphasized the existence of status distinctions, Anyway, sorry, that's...
Okay, thank you. So Nam Nin Ho asks asked questions. Any information on what the Japanese or Ming state did against the families of those who had deserted during the Imjin War in Chosŏn? Are there cases in which these Ming or Japanese settlers later returned to China or Japan? If there are, did the Chosŏn state let them go?
That's an interesting question. So at least during the Imjin War, so the Chosŏn did not let Japanese or resisted sending Japanese back to the Japanese state during the period when Chosŏn was asking for, of course, the return of Korean captives. They resisted against returning Japanese. Now, I may have missed some important record where they actually gave in once or twice, but as far as I know, they didn't return Japanese to Japan. During the Imjin War itself, of course, deserters were punished quite harshly by the Japanese state, the Japanese military in Chosŏn, because, of course, it was weakening the morale of the Japanese state when people deserted. As for the Ming, they did try and forcibly remove, with Chosŏn support, Chinese deserters within Chosŏn territory. As for those who returned after the fact, I don't know of any cases after the Ming had fully left the region. I don't know of any case of someone who returned later, in a later period at all. The Qing, of course, tried to forcibly remove all people of Chinese and Jurchen origin from the Chosun Peninsula, and a lot of them then tried to escape if they already had, especially if they had family connections in Korea already. I don't think there was any actual. I don't know of much record of actual formal punishment, but that may be just something I have missed.
Okay, thank you. We have next we have a question from Pierre Emmanuel Roux.
Okay.
Hi, Pierre Emmanuel. In Ming-Qing, China, the submitting foreigners who committed crimes were punished according to Chinese law, just as if they were Chinese nationals. This point is clearly mentioned in the Great Ming and Qing Code. Was it also the case for all submitting foreigners in Chosun, even though some benefited from a generous treatment, as Adam mentioned?
First of all, by the way, I forgot also to say hello to Namlin as well. But it seems that this talk is getting a lot more people I know in the question and answer. So as for being punishments, I think I don't know any precise reference that they should all be punished according to Chosŏn law. But I can't imagine that they would be punished according to a different law. In the area of my main focus, 17th and 18th century, I think the only laws on hand would be Chosŏn law. They did sometimes get lenient treatment as a result, though. So that there were cases of lenience, especially there were cases of lenience. I don't know if it was lenience based on their social status. Of course, I don't think it was necessarily the sort of lenience that was granted to people who weren't of foreign origin as well. So you could also, of course, grant lenience to people who are descendants of loyal subjects, famous loyal subjects or famous martyrs. But that's my answer in any case. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, next we have a question from Bai Hui Duan. Okay. As you mentioned the 4 different types of foreigners, I wonder whether you could talk more about their geographic distribution or settlement areas. Your book gives an impression that their locations scattered in the peninsula. I am still curious whether there were any particular regions for different foreigners. Another related question is about the flight routes of Liaodongese and Jurchens to Korea. After the rising of Jurchens, Liaodongese crossed the Yalu River and went through Pyongan province, while Jurchens went through Hamgyong province to other regions. They did not only settle in the 2 boundary provinces, but more of them moved further south. Did they also choose maritime routes to Korea?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I've only met Bai Hua over Zoom, but nice to see you again. That's an excellent question. Yeah, there were cases of maritime routes. You've covered the main routes very well and the main subject very well, but they did also cross over the sea, especially those who were associated with Mao Wenlong's armies. And some of them arrived as castaways. So Mao Wenlong, of course, was based in an island in Pyongan province, but his maritime empire during the wars of the Ming-Manchu wars of the early 17th century extended to Shandong, region of Shandong. And we have records of people arriving on the coast of Korea. They're usually described as castaways. I expect some of them would have been pure escapees, pure deserters or refugees in their own right who entered Chosŏn as well. One interesting feature is that, well, sometimes they appear in official records as well. I expect in a lot of cases they just, landed and got off, because late 16th, early 17th, the period post Imjin War was a pretty chaotic period in Chosŏn history. So I think some of them appear in later sort of retrospective records, but don't appear in the Chosŏn veritable records themselves. So I think possibly even more maritime arrivals than we know about, but certainly there were maritime arrivals as well.
Great, thank you. Next question by Seokhyun Hong. Were there any political or military factors that led Sayaga Kim to change his status from a Japanese soldier to a Korean soldier during the Imjin War?
Absolutely fantastic question. And this, I tried to remember the name of a Japanese scholar has looked into that quite a bit, and it's really interesting work. And he's very suspicious of a lot of our scholarship on Kim Chung-sun. Later records, which were possibly written by Kim Chung-sun's descendants, would describe Kim Chung-sun as always having wanted to move to Chosŏn, that he had deep desire to receive the civilizing power of the Chosŏn state, from a young lad. And therefore he deserted, according to this record, right away in, I think, 1592, in the immediate aftermath of the Japanese invasion of Korea. This particular I think it's surnamed Fujitani, argues is pretty unlikely. That first of all, the records that describe Kim Chung-sun's desertion in this manner tend to be late records, probably written by his descendants. Earlier records will sometimes use Confucian language, and some scholars will describe those as possibly the direct writing of Kim Chung-sun. And they will certainly use ideological language that Kim Chung-sun respects and admires the civilizing power of the Chosen state. However, even those records, I think we can suspect, will have been written partly to please the people who Kim Chung-sun needed to please, which is, of course, the high Chosen officials who could also get him into a lot of trouble if he were seen as a troublesome force. So I think it's very hard to say why Kim Chung-sun decided to move to Chosun now, because we don't have any really secure early sources for it. A lot of the people who this is my joke I say with my second year students, that if we look at the history of deserters and the important power of military deserters, we can see that love really is the most powerful force, because it seems a lot of people left because they met somebody. That's true of the Ming deserters in Southeast Asia, in what's now Yunnan. Right, they huge rate of desertion of Ming soldiers in Yunnan into the various local Dai polities and other polities, and most of them seems to be marriage had some involvement there in the desertion. Similarly, a lot of the Japanese and Chinese, it seems that a marriage may have preceded the desertion rather than following it. So I don't know precisely with Kim Chung-sun.
Okay. Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, and then one other important political and ideological factor is the Chosen state was actively recruiting Japanese because they needed Japanese deserters' support in order to prosecute the war. So it was also active policy from the Chosen state to encourage their desertion.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Namnin. He asked, when Chosun officials talked about the receiving end of the Chosun civilization, what did they specifically mean or refer to, if any, by Chosun civilization in comparison with the Chinese civilization?
That's a great question, and all I get is very, very specifically, some of the stereotypical language of morality and of rights and manners, etc., of the edification of the Chosen monarch. I've never seen. Trying to think. I don't think I've ever seen any record that specifically says those people coming from this morally corrupted outer world who are coming of China who are coming to Chosun. So never anything quite as on the nose as that. So I don't think there may not be a huge amount of content to it. It's a little bit like coming to Canada and the United States to find freedom, as sometimes comes up in modern North American version of the same sort of rhetoric. It's never very clear what people mean by freedom, right? So I think I would guess it's more on that line, but something worth thinking about.
Great, thank you. I think I have one related question to that. So can you talk a little bit about what you exactly mean by edification? So what was the state trying to do here? In order to edify these subjects, or imperial subjects, or Ming loyal subjects, or whoever it is, right? These foreigners in Chosun. What were some of the attempts that the Chosun state was trying to do?
So that's a good point. I mean, very, very practically, of course, the same term could also be used for rebellious subjects, right? So if there's a rebellion, people could return to their proper loyalties or tend towards their proper loyalties. So former Korean rebels could also have that. A reason why you can indeed doubt my translation, submitting foreigner, and I am fully willing to be criticized for that translation. I criticize it myself about once a day, and then I say, no, it's the best one. I won't abandon my faith to that, my special term, but anyone else is allowed to criticize it, of course. But there's the standard things. I mean, just settling them in some sort of a peaceful tax-paying status or tribute-paying status, proper system of marriage, of course, proper clothing. They would sometimes grant clothes and wives and surnames. Of course, granting of surnames and clan seats was also a key aspect of that. And that was one thing that's interesting is that for the early Chosun, Chinese people of Chinese origin could also be granted Korean clan seats. One interesting change again, really in the 18th century, is increasingly they were specifically granted Chinese clan seats to refer to their Chinese origins. So again, an interesting example of how starting in the mid-18th century, so the Chineseness of people who could claim, honestly or dishonestly, and in some cases clearly dishonestly, Ming Chinese origin was given real institutional shape by the Chosun state. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. We have another question from Ji-Hoon Chun. What is your observation of Chosun people's view of the Qing people residing in Chosun in the late 19th century? For example, Yuan Shikai and other Qing high officials or Qing military stationed during 1882 to 84, and again in 1894 for putting down Tonghak uprising. One Chosun high official said in 1893 that the Qing is different to us from other foreign nations. What do you interpret this?
Great question. I am not a late 19th century specialist. I by no means do I not. I would love to be able to answer your question a little bit better. My impression, I think there are other scholars who could answer that better than I, but let's see who. Just popping into my head is Joshua Fan Liu. I'm sure there are other people you could consult there as well. I know there are other people who could consult there as well. Or Bei Wusong. Bei Wusong also talks about that a bit. Is even in the late 19th century, views on Qing people were diverse. There is a notable shift in the attitudes of the Chosun state to the Qing in the 19th century, from the outright rejection of the 18th century to greater accommodation and greater respect for the Qing Empire in the 19th. This is also talked about, for instance, by Han Seung-hyun of Konkuk University, who also applies in Seung-hyun Han, if you look in Acta Koreana, who also applies that particular shift to some of the people I talk about in my book, in a very interesting article in Acta Koreana. So there was definitely a softening of attitudes towards the Qing, which had a somewhat of a downplaying of Ming loyalism, but that also shouldn't be over-exaggerated, as, for instance, Joshua Fan Liu and Bei Wusong points out, because of the righteous militias of the late 19th, early 20th century, some of them were willing to treat the Qing as a fellow ally and fellow civilizational member, but others were still thoroughly Ming loyalist and continued to reject the legitimacy of the Qing, even in the late 19th, early 20th century. And I have found people still using Ming loyalist dating in the 1990s. So that's the best answer I can give you, and there are better people to answer that than I, though. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Next, we have two questions from Professor Youngi Kim Renault. She's a senior advisor of our institute. Were some of these foreigners adopted by Korean families, or were they allowed to adopt the original Korean family names?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, because I actually have an answer for that. Adoption actually becomes this was one bit, a favorite bit, which I cut out from my book. And so at some point I want to publish it if someone else doesn't publish this wonderful story before. But there are cases of adoption. I mean, these foreign communities were not sealed off from the rest of Korean society. So there were Koreans who were adopted by these families, and then this became a controversy. Are they properly Chinese or not? Are they properly of Chinese origin or not? Are they faking their status? And there are people who changed their surnames for whatever reason. And the changed surname became an issue of controversy. So yeah, the adoption, intermarriage, simply settling in a submitting foreigner village were all ways in which someone would gain this submitting foreigner tax status without necessarily being of foreign origin at all. So it wasn't necessary. I mean, ancestry wasn't unrelated to the status, but this ancestry was frequently muddied by other processes.
That's interesting. So I have a follow-up question then. So then, did these people, did these foreign subjects themselves try to maintain their own Chinese origin identity, although they're living in Chosŏn? Or was it also the state at the same time? Was it also the state that tried to, just recognize them as foreigners? Well, I guess, okay.
No, this is a great question. I think I know what you're saying, but go on. Shall I answer?
Yeah, because I think, because you translated Hyangwain as foreigners, submitting foreigners. So, like we're talking in English, it keeps on, making me think as the state trying to, here, like they're the foreigners, right? But Hyangwain, so yeah, can you talk, I think this is interesting. Can you talk a little bit more about, so whether, because if there are cases that these foreigners were adopted or change their surnames to Korean surname, then because when we're thinking about their identities, there must be some, I don't want to use the word assimilation here, or integration, right? Integration into the Korean society. So can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, the best answer to it is, the one thing I got from this, and I don't know, I think maybe you get the same from your research, is the Chosen state was a little bit of a crazy mess, like all states, right? It had what it thought should happen, but then it was faced with the diversity of the circumstances of the people under its control, and they just didn't fit into the mold that the Chosen state wanted to maintain. They didn't. These hierarchies, I won't say they're meaningless, but they never quite worked. And so, did they actually think that? Hyangwain, you're right. Submitting persons would seem just a little bit weird to me, but I sometimes thought about changing to that because, yeah, it's not Hyangwa, which would be a weird phrase as well. The reason I said foreigner is because they're clearly imagined by the Chosen state to be in some ways foreign or descendants of foreigners. It comes up whenever Hyangwain are mentioned, they're mentioned people from outside. But they had been, in some cases, been in Korea for several centuries. And some of them really wanted to maintain the special privileges related to this status. And this desire to maintain special privileges related to the status grew especially during the 18th century, when these privileges became actual privileges. They weren't just protection from certain sorts of taxation. They granted you the right to engage in ritual practices in the palace, in the company of high officials. So that really changed the desirability of the status at that point. So there's always as it were, a push and pull, or an awkward interaction between what the court wants and what, insofar as we can divine it at all, the people who are recipients of this status want. I think your point is a good one. These foreigners aren't really foreigners, and they're foreigners who are imagined as people from outside the Chosen state, but by the 18th century, none of them spoke. There would have been no dialect differences even. They would have spoken exactly the language of the people around them. They would have not been that, those of them who received reasonably high status would have been not that different from other people with that status. And most people have even minor connection to young but aristocracy would claim some distinguished ancestor, would have some ritual practices, etc. That would be universal. Those of who still lived in fishing communities wouldn't have been that different from other people in islands, etc., engaged in fishing. So, yeah, they're not foreigners. By submitting, foreigners are not foreigners, but the Chosen state would often describe them as foreigners. So that's my limited justification for my translation. I'm glad I'm being taken to task for my translation. No one else has done that, so that's good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Adam. I think this concludes your talk. Well, thank you so much for our audience who stayed with us until the end, and also submitting interesting and amazing, fascinating questions. And I would like to thank once again Professor Adam Bonnet for his excellent presentation, and hope you can freely download his book. So please feel free to do so. And this is it was a page turner, and I really enjoyed reading his book. And I'll be asking him to select the best question that he likes, and we'll make sure to send a hard copy to the winner. All right, thank you all, and hope this concludes the Chosŏn Book Talk series of this semester, and hopefully we'll be able to prepare more of pre-modern Korean talks next semester. All right.
So I hope I made sense. I sometimes will lose track of presentation. So thank you all for listening.
All right, thank you.